us journalism photographers are, us journalism photographers, we have a lot of camaraderie. Well, we do in Australia as well. And so when we were working together, just with Dr. Ruid, it's natural that we have something in common because we've all got to get the picture. You know, we've all got to get something special. So I was working with, I mean, there's video and there's still photographs, and I've been working with Dr. Sanduk Ruid for maybe coming up in September this year, 30 years. So he would invite me. First time I met him was back in 1992 in Hanoi, and the Australian eye doctor Fred Hollows invited Dr. Sanduk Ruid to Hanoi to help him with some training Vietnamese eye doctors. I was hired by my newspaper, I was sent by my newspaper. I was a staff photographer in those days to take photographs, to wire the photographs, to send them via the telephone line back to Australia. Because Fred Hollows was like one of our, like Dr. Rui, like one of our humanitarian heroes. Little did I realise that I was going to start the beginnings of 30 years relationship with another humanitarian hero, Dr. Sanduk Rui. I've just been following Dr. Rui yesterday. He went to a book launch. He then took me to the Australian Embassy and we spoke to the ambassador and there was a function. And then afterwards we went to the TV studio and he did an interview on Galaxy Television with one of your most prominent television people and television stations. So now I'm seeing just how much of a humanitarian hero he is to the Nepalese. So what I was asked to do today was to talk a little bit about our profession. So because we've got quite a lot of challenges in Australia to do with our relevance and how digital media and social media, Google, is transforming our media, and us photographers are having the opportunity to work back in Australia. I'm not sure if the same issues occur for you here in Nepal, but yeah, I can discuss a little bit of that and my own perspective. I can share what I do. I have had a chance to look at some Instagram accounts of some photographers I'm now following. They followed me in the last couple of days and I'm now following them. I looked at the profile, I look at the pictures, I'm looking at these hardcore demonstrations. I'm looking at, some of you guys must be the ones with helmets on and having, you know, bricks and rocks thrown. So I'm really not one of those sort of photographers. I admire a lot the hardcore journalism photographers, and someone's got to go out and do all that. But I think, you know, what I can share is something we all probably have to do at some stage, other than the big news events, and that's to photograph, to document in documentary form or photojournalism form, and we can discuss the difference between these categories: documentary, photojournalism, newspaper photography. I separate all three of those myself in how I might do something. If I was to show you my profile now, my website is how I'll discuss some photographs and things like that. I do a little bit of all of those things as a freelance photographer. The main element in all of this is storytelling. And the main element in most of it too is like that I portray a sense of truthfulness in the photography. Although I may use styles that I'm interacting with the subject and we're creating some picture between the two of us. I'm still trying to represent a sense of truthfulness. Even the candid moment captured is not necessarily capturing the truth in many respects. And I'm happy to be debated that with anyone in the crowd if they want to later on. So maybe I just talked about why I'm here. I'm here because the Tej Collie Ruit Foundation hired me to come from Australia to make almost a series, a library of photographs of the iCamp that we just completed. And they'll get used in multiple platforms on the Foundation's website and exhibition, given to potential investors in donation for image, awareness of the issues to do with blindness prevention. All of these uses these pictures will be put to use in these sorts of forms. So, this is just like the first time that Mr. Tej Collie and Dr. Ruit came together. So, I believe they wanted some really compelling pictures of that. And I also believe they probably needed somebody who could get things done. Not necessarily just photograph what's happening, but to make some compelling images that can be used in multiple forms. And my boss up the back here, hopefully I've fulfilled that brief. But in amongst that, pure documentary photographs of the patients and their movements. Some of the pictures are almost like contemporary portraits, so they can be used in certain media that art directors and creative directors, picture editors might expect in perhaps the Western world, and say for example in the UK, where one of Mr. Tej Collie is based. So if I start to just show you some things to start to talk, I can talk a little bit too about the stories I did for the World Press Club that were entered into the World Press Photo and that won a prize. It probably wouldn't win a prize today because there was a category way back then called the Science and Technology category. And so my stories were just like perfect for that category. They don't have that now. I think it might be called contemporary issues. So I could enter it in that, but then I'd be up against every other contemporary issue that there is. There's so many. So perhaps I'll first just talk a little bit about just my general. I don't call myself anymore a photojournalist. I would say I'm a photographer. And sometimes I get to do a photojournalistic job. And sometimes I get to do a job where actually it's very boring, there is nothing really interesting happening. I've got to make a compelling photograph. And I might bring in my studio flash. With all of these iCamps that I do, I will take a small studio flash setup, even to the most remote places, because I'm thinking that I need to create a photograph these days that's beyond the phone. I mean, everyone's got one of these. To prove my point, an article's just been featured about myself in the Kantipur newspaper. And I believe the main photo was done by the journo who just went like click and took one frame of the two of us. And it's the main featured photograph in that article. Now, it didn't matter for that article because it was a bit of a low-key sort of article. But we're all competing with just this phone. So, how can I make a photograph that really gives value to us photographers? So perhaps if I could get this thing going, I could at least give you a bit of an idea about that, and then maybe in a broad brushstroke way. And then maybe I talk about the World Press Photo series.
Michael, before we start the presentation, I would like to request our federal FNJ committee member and former president of photojournalism, Mr. Prakash Karki, and and our General Secretary of Photojournalism Club, to welcome Mr. Michael Amendolia.
Thank you very much. You're the president. Oh, I'm honoured. I'm very honoured to. I've never been given one of these hats. Does it suit me? I mean, it doesn't suit me. I'm going to have to get a photograph. Now, well, I can say that Nepal is my, well, second favourite country. I mean, I do love the country I come from, Australia. And I do identify very much as an Australian. But second to that, I love coming back to Nepal. I mean, this is the people. It's more the people than anything that I really love coming back to Nepal. And I do feel a little connection after all these years. All right, well, thank you very much. And we love getting these cutouts. He died at the age of 65. What the Fred Hollows Foundation has done in the last 30 years, and I've had involvement, is like unbelievable, way beyond what Fred Hollows himself, this gentleman up here, could ever have imagined. And Dr. Ruid has been part of that for Australia, as well as obviously to all of Nepal. He's become an international humanitarian, worthy of Nobel Prize if it ever is given to him, but it'll be possibly the. Now here's a picture of Dr. Ruid, and I can click on this one. I'll click on this one just so you can see it. I've got this picture that I did in Ladakh of Dr. Ruid, and that other picture that you saw of Fred Hollows in black and white, I didn't click on that. Let me just. This is a good example actually. The two different styles of photography. Let me go back to that one. This one here, whoops, let's go back. This one here has just happened in front of me, and I've just moved this way and gone, click, captured it, right? As it turns out, this has become like an iconic photograph in Australia of one of our great humanitarians. It was just more luck than anything. In actual fact, to tell you the real story behind this, he's actually talking to the TV reporter. And after taking lots of photographs of him seeing patients and doing this and whatever, he's just stopped for a moment to talk to this journalist. And I'm just kneeling down in front of him, not saying anything, and just captured that moment. As it turns out, it's become quite a significant photograph. He's explaining, this young boy who was brought over, he's explaining how he can fix his eye, and that Dr. Ruid will do a surgery on him later, and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff, right? So that picture is just candidly captured. In actual fact, it's nothing special moment, but it's worked out, just the background came together, painted this portrait. Oops, let's go back. I've created this portrait of Dr. Ruid. It's like a cover shot. It's like I need a cover shot. It's like a contemporary sort of thing. But it's happened amongst all the patients. The patients are having their patches taken off. And I've organised to have my little portable studio flash, which is just basically, in this particular case, I believe it was just a Canon, one little Canon flash, that bounces into an umbrella and just lifts him out of the landscape. We were just lucky the combination of the background was just a nice balance with the foreground. It was about the same sort of, it wasn't like the background was sunny and the foreground was cloudy. They were sort of a bit the same. And so my flash is really just lifting it a little bit. So that I wouldn't call photojournalism. That's sort of like portrait photography or whatever. But that's really been a great, it's telling the story because Dr. Ruid's the doctor. They're all the patients he's just operated on the day before. And the background has got Buddhist monks who are like the volunteers. So it tells a story, but in the end, it's really all about him. So there's a good little example of the photojournalism, and what I might suggest is sort of like, well, that's like contemporary portrait. So sometimes for some articles, I've got to create a contemporary portrait. Can you come to this foreground here? I need that background. I'm going to light you with these lights and all that sort of stuff. So in Australia, once upon a time, all I ever did was like photojournalistic stories. The German magazine might hire me to do a documentary series on wine in Australia, or to go to East Timor and follow Shanana Gusmao, who is the then current president, or I might go to Kiribati, where we're doing a story about climate change, or something like that, right? And they'll all be documentary photographs. Sometimes the magazine asks me to photograph the comedian, the guy here with the ball in his hand. He's just a crazy guy, and I've just got to come up with an entertaining photograph.
Michael, sorry for interruption. If you have
Do I leave the hat on?
no, it's up to you. If you want, you can. I'm just suggesting if we can put the laptop today, you can use it for conversation.
Oh, yeah, good idea. Yeah. Okay. Well, no, we've got it all hooked up. It's not moving. I won't move around. I won't move around.
No.
So anyway, look, to get back to the point, without waffling on, I'll get to the photojournalistic story and start to talk about that. But I just thought I'd let you know about how we in Australia, a lot of us, we have to be versatile. We can't just be one thing necessarily. I was just saying earlier to you that the Sydney Morning Herald, which might be the equivalent of, say, the newspapers that you have here, the Himalayan Times or something like that, they only have like about 3 or 4 staff photographers now. Now those staff photographers probably do mainly photojournalism. Some of them might have to do, like I have to do, a contemporary portrait or something like that. But it's really become a scenario, very few pure documentary photojournalists, that's all they do. There's very few of those these days. There's not a lot of them. So in amongst my opening page of my website, I've got jobs that I've done for a medical organisation, a hospital, a corporate portrait of the chief executive, all sorts of things like this. Oh, have a look at this one. This is my one that I did. I was thinking about doing some photo workshops at one stage. I was here in Kathmandu for a week, just photographing the tourist sites and things. And I just walked around the streets with a little Fuji rangefinder camera. That's probably what I love to do the most, actually. Just to have this little small camera, not all the lights and cameras and stuff that the guys would have seen. That's sort of like the most fun thing to do. What I think I'll show you now, just so that we get more to the topic of your most interest, let's get to these stories that I've done that won a World Press Photo Award, and perhaps I can explain how I came to create these stories. In 1998, Dr. Sandra Gruy invited me to Tibet to go with him and his Tilgunga team. And in those days, I would do the story, I would write some stories sometimes as well, and we would offer it for sale to a magazine. As it turned out, Time magazine actually ran this story, and one of their writers actually wrote the text. And so I'm with Dr. Ruik for we were there for 10 days or so in Tibet. We went from one little eye camp and some training of surgeons to another quite remote place. And I'm shooting it all in black and white, and I will process all of this in a dark room back at home. In those days, the reason for doing black and white here was to make it it was the right form for this story. This story was a black and white story, I felt. It had to have a seriousness to it, creatively, it had to have a seriousness to it. And all of this is captured purely candidly, like a photojournalist would capture. we didn't need, I mean, it was just so rich in cultural and journalistic content. It was just fantastic that the high technology of these little intraocular lenses being implanted into the eye of the blind person with a really severe cataract made it an incredible science and technology story, and so that's why it won that award. Now I'm just going to the next shot. When I'm doing this series, I'm really seriously trying to find impact. It's got to have powerful visual impact, and it's also got to have emotional impact. So that's what I'm trying to seek when I'm doing each one of these photographs. First of all, there's the shoot, photographing everything and all the aspects of the story. Have I got all the different dimensions to the story? The wide shots, the close-up shots. Have I captured all the elements to actually what they're doing there? Patients are coming down from their homes. They're being led down by those family members. Sometimes they're coming in this particular case, on the back of like a horse and cart. In this instance here, we went to the family's home, and as I'm walking into the home, bang, that's what I'm seeing right in front of me. So I just lift my camera and go click. I got a little rangefinder Leica camera in those days, and I just had that little camera around my neck, and I lifted up, and within a moment or two, that whole dynamic had changed. They got up, came towards me, and suddenly I didn't have that moment again. But luckily I'd got 1 or 2 frames before it all changed. We're driving in full alleyway of pressurising the eye before they have their surgery. It just looked like a dark scene that I thought was worthy of an atmospheric picture as part of the surgery. They were doing this surgery under, most of the time, like a generator. It was like a simple, and often the generator would conk out, so in the middle of surgery, they would have to rejig the generator to keep the electricity going so that they could do the surgery. It was a really difficult circumstance for the doctors, the nurses team. That's another surgical shot. They're also, while they're doing that, they're training the doctors so that when they leave, the Tibetan doctors can carry on this surgery. This is the intraocular lens being put into the eye. This is one of those scenarios when it all happens very quickly. I can't actually quite remember. I can't imagine I would have had a macro lens at the time. But now I work with a 100mm macro lens, and very often I'm using studio flash as well to balance the brightness inside that eye and then the darkness around the outside. If I didn't use a flash, the photograph wouldn't be successful, and I can show you some of those photographs of what I do now relative to these. These were done 20 years ago. I can show you what happens now with a digital camera. It's sort of the same but slightly different. So we went to a monastery, and he just happened to be cataract blind. We were just going to visit. In actual fact, we were waiting to have a special visit for Dr. Rui with the Kamapa. And eventually we got to, prostrate ourselves before the Kamapa, just shortly after I took this photograph here. But that monk happened to be cataract blind. So I added him to the sort of story. Now these are the last couple of shots of where Dr. Rick's taking the patches off to see how successful the operation is. Most of the time he knows it's successful, but there's a process of taking the patch off, putting an antiseptic around the eye, and then giving them another patch of which it will recover for the next couple of days and weeks afterwards. And I think the last shot is where, there we go, that's another shot where he's meeting the patients, taking the patches off, telling them what to do for the next couple of weeks while it recovers. I think the last shot is where the patient's able to walk away by themselves. Maybe that's not in there, I didn't include it in that one. I'll go back to the other story I was going to show, which is actually just down the road, just down here where Tilgunga is. And on one of these, when I came for the Tibet trip, for this trip here, I fly to Kathmandu and then the whole team goes off to Tibet. And I've paid for the flight to come here. And then the rest of it is all part of the team. Well, I got to go down to Pashupati and I was told about the corneal donation at Tilgunga. They were trying to get this situation back 20 years ago, where they were asking the family of the people that have just been brought to the Pashupati, they've just passed away, they're about to be cremated. Just before we cremate, do you mind, I mean, can we procure the outside layer of the eye for possible transplanting into somebody who's damaged their cornea? And most people back 20 years ago still had that issue of we need to cremate the entire body, otherwise there might be some issues with the reincarnation, with the afterlife. You know, I'll be blind in the afterlife if I don't get cremated with all of my. So then there was a big public awareness program. So when we first came, virtually no donors. The first time I came. The second time I came, I would spend weeks with the eye bank at Tilgunga. We'd sit there, we'd go down to Pashupati, he would go and approach a family, and most of the time it was no, very rarely. I think it turned out I was here for like 2 weeks, and we might have got 2 or 3 people that said yes. And so it was enough for me to start to get a few photographs. So there you can see almost the whole photo story there, although they're very small pictures. I'll click through each one of them now. Now, to set the scene, it's the same today as what it was 20 odd years ago. I've got to show in the first picture of the photo essay what the problem is. The problem is the eye there is damaged, corneal damage, and there has to be something done about that issue. With cataract blindness, it's a build-up of material inside the lens of the eye that prevents sight, that means being able to see. The story that I've just done a matter of days ago opens with the same sort of picture. It's a little bit irregular, but we've got to show the problem, I think, in the first picture. That's exactly the scene. I've just captured exactly what happened there. And the fact that someone's burning in the background, and we can see the temple either further in the background. It's sort of not like a great shot, but it's an information sort of shot. But it's sort of, in a historical sense, says a lot. Shankar, that's the guy that I was following with, the two of us, the guy who's from, he's the eye bank manager right now. Here, he was, I don't think he was the manager at that stage, but he was the guy who would come down with a little box and a scalpel and would just cut the cornea out, put it in a ice pack, and sometimes they're transplanted at Tilgunga, sometimes they go to other countries, even Bangladesh or even Southeast Asia. So each one of these pictures are like just pieced together the story. Here we are in one of the little rooms that they've created down there. And they no longer do it right on the gap, they now put it into this like incision type room. You've got to get a close-up of what's going on. So I've got this, I mean, look, a lot of this story didn't publish a lot of places because most of the time people are a bit squeamish about a cornea being cut out of an eye. But as you can see there, that's the cornea being cut out of the eye. This is one of the recipients of the cornea. She had, she's being inspected at the moment by Dr. Rita Gurung, who is the CEO of the Tilgunga Eye Centre down there. Tilgunga Institute of Ophthalmology. So this is one of the patients, and if you've ever been to Tilgunga, it's always a hive of activity. But we're going back 22 years ago to this now. So she does the surgery. I'm following somebody having their corneal surgery, and Dr. Guru, who is the head of the hospital down there, eye hospital. And again, I've got to get a picture of the close-up shot. So she's about to put the donated cornea onto the top of this damaged eye, and she'll sew it together. Then, of course, I've got to personalise the story. If I don't personalise it, there's no emotional aspect. So we're following this girl's operation. We go back to her home eventually. I think I came back 9 months later, and we went to her home to see how she progressed, how she'd gotten over her operation, had her sight improved. I think that's how the photo essay finishes, with her, with her family at home, looking in the mirror. I think probably at this stage now, I'll just show you the 2 World Press photo ones that I got an award for. Talked a little bit about the process. Talked a little bit about how I'm not just a photojournalist, I'm also a storytelling photography, but sometimes with contemporary portraits. Has anyone got a question from any of that? If otherwise, I'll just keep going on.
I just have a very small question. I don't know much about the film photography, but what I've noticed is the color tone is different.
Sorry, say that again.
The black and white photography
yes,
you have got, the color tone, it has got different, I guess.
The color tone is different.
Right. The orange tint, I guess.
I mean, I wouldn't take that too seriously. Later, come over and see what it really looks like. This doesn't do it justice. I mean, it's come through a data projector. Yeah, so I'm sorry. I should just let you know. It's come through a data projector. So it looks great here. It doesn't look great there. I mean, it's not a good...
No, I don't mean to say that, but is it your own choice to put a small orange filter, I guess? The post-processing which you have done is...
with black and white or colour?
Right.
Which one? Sorry, black and white?
Black and white, yes.
No, it's pure black and white. If you were to look at this screen here, you would see just black and white. The data projector has picked up a colour warmth. The picture looks nothing like that. I'm sorry, but I mean, you can come and have a look here later and you will see.
Probably he was like confused. I mean, like the first series you took in the film, right? Or is it digital?
They were both on film. They were both on film. But anyway, look. The point being is, there's no. Sorry, there is no like. I put no tone on it or anything like that. It's just purely black and white. Yeah. I didn't even selenium tone it because. I hate these days I don't want to go in a dark room. There's just so many toxic chemicals and whatever. I better just keep this thing going. I mean, we might have lost our connection. Anyway, should I just continue on? Sure. Yeah, sure. All right, well, what I thought I could talk about now, again with Dr. Ruitt. Actually, what did I show? You guys, who have I got here in the crowd here? Majority of you work for a newspaper, is that right?
Most of
them work for a newspaper. And most of the time you're doing news. Yeah. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Well look, why don't I show you one news scenario? Because it's no point me showing a whole bunch of things for something and you guys not really into it. I mean, why don't I show you a news scenario? Well, actually, no, I'll finish the blindness thing first, because you all do feature stories. I did go with Dr. Ruitt. Now, these pictures, this photo essay here, let's go back, sorry, one more. I'm going to show the blindness thing. Let's go back to, there it is. I went to North Korea with Dr. Ruitt. Now this is, again, just pure documentary. Don't look at the colours here because it's a lot brighter than what it is. It's actually very pastely looking. It looks a lot brighter than what it actually is in reality. But I'm just going to click through this series of photos of Dr. Ruit training the surgeons in North Korea and doing hundreds of operations every day on these North Korean cataract blind people. I won't talk too much about it, I'll just click through and then I can move on to the next subject. So I just brought this down to, well actually there's a lot of pictures here. It was sort of hard to work in North Korea because they had so many restrictions. I couldn't really travel even out of the hospital much. But it's like going back in time. I mean, if you think that there's parts of Nepal that seem like it's going back in time, well, it's sort of nothing compared to North Korea. But Dr. Ruit they were amazed because basically he did more surgery in the first one day than the country had done in the entire year. But to him it was nothing because they do that all the time. Of course, in North Korea, the great leaders, they have their pictures up on the wall. See, look, that looks very orange there, whereas here you'll see it looks very like desaturated and actually not very colourful. So it's not a good indictment. So again, I've got to get that sort of close-up shot. And I think in the end, we have the great leaders' portraits and the patients prostrating themselves before great leaders rather than thanking their doctor and their nurse team. Here's a typical news type story. Let me talk about this one. Nauru is a location that the Australian government sent all of the refugees that had made their way by boat on this particular tamper. In actual fact, it's probably very difficult. I should probably just talk more than show photos because I think the way it's projected, you can almost hardly see the image. So I wanted to have a little bit of reference point up here, but in actual fact, it's sort of really hard to see the photographs. So maybe I'll just talk more, and maybe we could have an open discussion, perhaps, about some of the issues that we all have these days. Maybe you could tell me. I'd be interested to know what issues you guys have in the current media environment in Nepal. That might be the best thing we can do, because really, I guess, we're not properly seeing these pictures on this screen. I'll just scroll that sort of down, and anyone can sort of ask me a question. My website is actually more than anything aimed at getting a job, basically. I want clients from the hospital, from the NGO, to look at my website and think that, well, I think that he might be able to. So if you really want to have a look at what the tones and all that sort of stuff, I can share later my web. I no longer work at the newspaper very much because, first of all, it's a young person's game. Once upon a time they'd have senior photographers. Well, they have to pay the senior photographer too much. So they'll pay the younger photographer, they pay them less, they'll work harder, they'll work long hours. So that's the scenario. So I'm more working now with all the things I've learned from the newspaper, but I'm doing it now for the university, or for the hospital, or for the sort of aged care facility. One day, you guys might have to move from the newspaper to some other form of photography. Well, that could be another avenue for you in the future, perhaps, because we have to always think that things are changing. That's the certainty of things. Things are always changing. So in amongst all of this, these days are really stuff for organisations, photographs for organisations. If I click on this one, this is where I've had the opportunity, very fortunately, through that earlier Fred Hollows Association, to now do the photographs for the fundraising for the Fred Hollows Foundation. Sunitha is working at Tilgunga, and so she knows a little bit about the sort of the brochures that are created, the website work that's being done. This is the closest thing I come to journalism, but still it's not like journalism that you would do, say for the New York Times. The New York Times, I'm told there's like an ethical policy of really not, one can only photograph what's happening in front of you. Maybe you might get an opportunity to make a portrait, but it's quite clearly that you've made a portrait. It's not manipulating any sort of event or news event or something. With the NGO photography, as you can see over here, I'm using my studio lights to make a portrait of the blind person. The reason for that is that I need the photographs to have a really strong impact. And I need to have the pictures to be more than just recording of. Some of the pictures are absolutely the recording of what's happening. And then other times I've got to make some pictures that will have an extra impact for the sake of the raising money for blind, in this case, blindness problems. It could be, I could be working for Action Aid, and those problems would be to do with other issues. Or Save the Children Fund, which I've also worked for, where that's about issues to do with youth and injustices with their in certain developing countries, or even Australia. So yeah, I mean, you know, when I'm doing something like this, I'm thinking, well, look, what can I do in a storytelling sense that I would have done for the newspaper? What can I do for the Fred Hollows Foundation to show the donors or the government authorities the great work that they're doing? And so I'm looking at everything from capturing the surgery to maybe do a portrait of the whole surgical team at the end, so they can see the faces of the professionals that are creating this work. Perhaps I can follow the patient back to their home so people can see the difficult life, perhaps, that they live in a little village somewhere. I'll do the surgical photos, although they don't tend to get run very much because people can't stand the sight of a lens being put into an eye, or eye surgery of any kind. I'll find the cultural things in each country just to make something look, so people get a feeling for the people. Again, I'm just scrolling through so you can just roughly see. I guess we could talk a little bit about, well, should I now ask the group, is there anyone who wants me to elaborate on anything in particular that could be helpful to the group? What do you think? Why don't you ask me some questions? I think, because I'm worried that I'm not connecting with what you want to know about.
I think it's not a big
I'm
problem.
just telling you a story back in the photojournalism days to now.
Okay.
You have switched the profession in some way, right?
That's a good point. That's a good point. Photojournalism days, well, our biggest problem, of course, and I don't know if it applies for, is that they hire freelancers. And they'll hire freelancers on a sort of semi-regular sort of basis. It's not the golden days of newspaper journalism necessarily. There's still great work being produced, but it's the advertising dollars that allow the editorial team to get this budget to create more great content, I guess, or great stories and things. So So that's the difference between then and now. Of course, there are so many great outlets on websites and whatever for great photography. It's just, are you going to get paid for it? That's the problem for us in Australia. I mean, I could do a story for the Guardian newspaper, and I might only get $300. Now, that, in your terms, that might sound like a lot of money, but not in our terms when you have the camera equipment, all the the computer gear you need to have and whatever. So that's the reason I've had to work for organisations and some corporate clients and things like that. So I really despair, actually, as to where we can create our most sort of meaningful photography, because there's not a lot of outlets in photography anymore, really. There's not that many outlets for where you're being paid for it, where you're being paid for it. I think there is something to be said for like the photo exhibition that you put together, or although again, it's an issue about how you're going to get some money for it, because a lot of our work in journalistic terms is not necessarily for the art market. It's not going to be purchased to necessarily put on your wall. Very small amount of it, I guess. So yeah, it is an issue. It sounds like if a lot of you are all working as working photographers, you haven't actually had that problem just yet. And I'm hoping you don't. I'm hoping it doesn't get to that stage here. But it certainly did get to that stage in Australia. And it's not to say that there's not great photography being done. There is. But it's not quite the profession that it probably was once. And it comes down to probably Google, Facebook. The advertising is going in the places where they're not even creating any content. Google and Facebook create nothing. They just simply share it. They're a platform for sharing all the content. And the advertising dollars is going to them and not to the sources like newspapers and things like that. So I'm hoping it doesn't come to that in Nepal, but I think maybe eventually it might come to that in Nepal. Let's hope not. So yeah, to talk about another sort of thing I could talk about, which is creating, your own project. I get the feeling when you work, say, for example, at the newspaper, you get given an assignment, and it's like the demonstration or the political guy who is just, the politicians and all of their, just the general content for the newspaper, right? A lot of that material, we have to do it, we have to cover it, right? But it may not give us as photojournalists like personal creative satisfaction necessarily. It depends. If you're a hardcore news guy, you just want some demonstration to go off, But if you're someone who really wants to create some thoughtful documentary photography, which is photography that might last the test of time, records of your culture, records of your society and things like that, there is a plethora of subject matter out there. I'll just give you one example of something that I would love to have done something. I'm there for the ICAM, I've got my job to do, I do my job. But I was watching these ladies that are bringing like leaf material down to their animals, their cows, their cattle, I guess, to feed them. And they've got this huge, like, greenery. Like, you see them carried on their back, I was thinking, I'd love to do a series of portraits of those people. That would be so interesting to others, If I was to share that with, that'd be a World Press Photo portrait series. I mean, I'm not saying you should do it directly for the World Press Photo, but if I didn't see a wonderful little portrait series there of these ladies. Now, you would have the connection because you're Nepali. I didn't take any photographs. I saw them coming down. Part of me thought, I just wanted to photograph so I could show my children, not to take a great shot. But I thought, no. I'd have to stop them. introduce myself. I don't have to ask them, you know, do you mind if I take a photograph? Oh, I'm doing it for this reason. You know, rather than just take a snapshot. I could have just been like a tourist who just gone click, click, click as they walk past. But I didn't. Now you guys could just do a whole great series on these people. I mean, I guess the thing is, because you're Nepali, you look at it and go, oh yeah, there's stacks of those old ladies that you know, bring that stuff down to their cows. But I thought it was quite unique, you know. So it's interesting how if you went to Australia, you might pick up on something in Australia that we go, oh yeah, we've seen that 100 times. And you can pick it up. So, yeah, think a little bit out of the box. And I must admit, I thought of it as me bringing something like, in a creative sense, almost surreal-like, by bringing the lighting with them in the landscape. I thought that could create something that was visually interesting and also told their story. So I realise there's a lot of hardcore news guys here. And I'm suggesting something which might be, and look, damn me for it if you wish. There's one quote I want to bring up, and it was brought up by Nick Nichols from National Geographic magazine, one of the great wildlife photographers. And he suggested that photography's sort of come, and it resonated with me, photography's come too far now to just necessarily photograph what's there. He's suggesting, you know, the idea of bringing the flash, like, or say, for example, using the drone. You know, using the drone, or using the robot camera. You've got this robot that's remote controlled, straight up to the close-up of the animal, and you're getting this perspective. Now, it's or setting up the trap, setting up the camera trap. The photographer actually doesn't see the picture, but it's taken hoping that the animal will come into the certain area. He does all that sort of photography. Now, it probably doesn't relate to you guys as press guys, press photographers, but it's again one of those scenarios of sort of thinking outside the box to create imagery that's going to compete with the phone. Everyone's got one of these. I mean, isn't it annoying? I must be able to get one little thing of camaraderie here. Doesn't it annoy you that you go to some event and you're trying to get a good picture and all these people are all there with their phone trying to get a picture with their bloody phone, and most of it will be hopeless. Most of it will be just useless. But you've got to push them out of the way so you can get in and get that picture. Everyone's got their bloody phone. And the quality of the good phones, like, are amazing in good light. In bad light, it's terrible. But in good light, it's actually pretty publishable, really, especially in a newspaper. So, yeah. So, what did you ask me to do? Do you want to talk about before and after, the old days and the nowadays? Right. Well, look, the fact of the matter is, we can only learn from the old days. We only ever live in the present moment, don't we? So, all I ever care about really is now. I can learn from, we need to know the history of photography and say even press photography, so we know where we are in the scheme of things, I guess. But it's now is the only thing that really matters. I don't go back to film. I don't have any nostalgia about film. The only one I think might have nostalgia would be an art photographer, because there might be some bit they can convince their benefactors that by doing it with traditional film, there is this extra craft or sorts of value or whatever. I mean, let's face it, our modern cameras are able to take photos in the dark. You know, the Sony, the Nikon, the Canon, the best of those cameras, the sensor is so amazingly, we're able to do stories in the dark now that were impossible with film. So I can't be bothered with any thoughts about film. Film has to be scanned. Like, so what's the point? You might as well just have it on your digital camera. I get it that you might want a camera which is like inconspicuous if you're working in the street. Say I'm doing street photography in the streets. Then I really want a little rangefindery type camera. that I don't look like I'm a serious photographer, and I can just quickly take a quick shot. The great thing these days is we've got these little flip screens. My camera has got this fantastic little flip screen where I don't even need to look. I can even focus off the back screen of this little R6 Canon. I mean, I've only got Canon because I have Canon lenses and things. Nowadays, it doesn't really matter that much. You can have Canon lenses on your Sony or whatever. But what I love now is I've got this little flip screen, and if I was doing street photography, I could be just focusing by touching the back of the screen there to get the focus, and they don't even know I'm taking a picture. I'll say something for this camera, you'll know what I'm talking about. Eventually that lens packed it in. Eventually that lens. We're together, and I wanted to take this picture of a landscape, which I thought was incredible. It was like this football field on like a stone surface in this sort of like, almost like a sort of a pit of sorts, with a lovely little temple-y thing. It wasn't a temple, but it was a lovely little Nepali type building up there. So I wanted to do a panorama, and I just slipped, and I went smash down with this camera into the ground. It was only from here to there. It was just like standing like this. And I thought I'd smash my camera. I have got to get that lens repaired, because it did eventually, the focus is not, anyway. But I tell you what, these Canon cameras, it survived that quite hard fall, and I was just absolutely amazed. Now I've had to put my other lenses on. The other one has to be repaired. It packed it up down in Tilgunga when I was doing some photographs in the lens factory. But anyway, the point being is I understand why you might want a rangefinder type camera for street photography. But really, I don't know why anyone would bother with film anymore. And that was the old days. Let's talk about the old days. So the good days today is that like our cameras I can be underexposed by virtually 2 stops and still save it, and it doesn't look like there's any like degradation of the image. So it's great. If you overexpose a bit, then there's some problems. But even then, you can sort of save things, can't you? Now that couldn't happen in the old days. Film, you know, was pretty bad if you had colour transparency and you'd underexposed by 2 stops. There's not much you could really do about it. It wasn't going to try and scan it and bring it back. It was pretty hopeless. So,
since this evolvement of the technology, do you think the audience and viewer choice have changed?
The involvement with technology.
Since you were using film camera and now to mirrorless, do you think in a picture, audience want something better?
Let's face it. How many millions of billions of images are seen every day just on Instagram? That's just one platform. Can't worry too much about that. I think by thinking local, the local people will still want to know what that local scenario is all about. You know, so I guess you've all got a role to play, because the local Kathmandu Nepali person is going to open up their newspaper and they want to see the images that relate to their life. You know, but on a bigger scale, it is really hard to get attention when there's so many images. I mean, I must admit, when I get on my Instagram and I'm sort of just scrolling down, it's an extraordinary image that's going to stop me. You know, otherwise, most of the time it's like, oh yeah, ordinary. It's all it's pretty good. It's okay. And it's just like when there's something that's really gone out of its way to be compelling or different, is when I really stop. So that's what I'm considering. Now, when you're a news photographer, you've got the difficulty because you can't change anything, really, can you? I mean, there is this ethical element that you've got to stick to, and it's more about, I would think if I was in your situation, it'd be about what access I can get. Now, there might be sort of things within your society that sort of, you've got to keep, what's the word for it? You've got to, the protocols, you've got to stick to the protocols, you know. But I guess if I was in your position, even my position back in Australia, if I was working as a newspaper photographer, I'd be trying to get special access to the subject. That's about as much as you can do to get more compelling images. I think it's just as important as a photographer to have a personality that can talk to other people, to convince them that you could get better access to the politician or the subject or whatever. That's something you can do that's within the bounds of ethical practice, you know. So what would be an example? I mean, you know, you're travelling with a politician to the rural sector. Can I just spend a little time in the back of your car as you make your way there? I'm giving you a simple little example, you know. Maybe Nepali audience would be surprised to see the picture of the politician in the back of his car as he's on social media or discussing things with his press guy, his press secretary, or his advisor or something. Now, that might be beyond what you're allowed to do here. I might be treading on toes, as we would say, you know what I'm saying? But I think one has to really look at how can I do something different, and how can I not do what everyone else is doing? You know, I mean, as a newspaper photographer, I was always trying to do that. If everyone was photographing this, I was thinking, well, I'm probably going to find another angle of this, because what's the point otherwise if we're just all getting the same shot?
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No.
You've been covering for Dr. Sunduk for more than almost like 30 years.
Yeah.
It's same assignment, and you've been still doing for that. And how could you find a different angle, composition,
I'm so
content?
glad you asked that question. I'm so glad you asked that question, because this is something that I had to come to thinking about at one stage too. Because I was thinking, well, if it's about my career, I'm just telling the same story over and over again. But let's face it, football, if you're doing the football every weekend, if you're doing a sporting event every weekend, it's the same story as well. You know, they have a game, and admittedly, there's different players. Same here, there's different players. There's different people, patients are different, it's a different country, but it is much the same sort of story. As I showed in those two things, you know, it's like almost a repetition in both those stories. There's the blind person, here's this scenario, they have their cataracts out happily ever after, you know, it's a little bit the same. Well,
Probably the locations and the people, they are
the people are different, the location's different. I'm actually just taking advantage, I'm feeling like it's something that's, for me to get meaning out of it, I'm thinking, well, I've got the connection with these people. I know the scenario. So I just continue to do it because I feel like it's something that I can contribute in the blindness prevention scenario. So if I was wanting to do unique, creative work, I wouldn't be choosing to do this necessarily. You know? But I actually enjoy doing it. I enjoy travelling with these groups. Another thing I wanted to mention about this too is that I like the idea that it's a story about possibilities. Someone has to do a story about the problem, and I've done more than my fair share of the problem. But we have to think about stories that are about possibilities in society. Usually most stories that are good stories, they've got a conflict in some way. And so that conflict makes it interesting. But and rather than just being, as I would say, a puff piece, just a publicity story, I like the idea that the story is making one think, well, we can actually do something about this. This is not another problem that we just go, it's without solution. It's without a solution. It's like, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian story. It's just like, it's without solution. If I went to Palestine, quite frankly, I mean, again, if I'm to give anything to you, and this is just a personal thing, right? If I went to Palestine, if I went to Israel, I would not be doing a story of the guys throwing rocks at them. We've seen that, but look, you're news photographers, you're going to have to go and photograph the rocks being thrown. But I'm going to go where there's a story where Palestinians and Israelis are trying to build peace amongst themselves. That's a story about possibilities. Like, I'm going to do that story because I don't want to be perpetuating the same imagery that's been... Someone's going to do it. Reuters, Associated Press, Getty, the Getty guy of the day, whoever else, someone's got to go and do that, because the daily press has got to have a picture of the rocks being thrown and the Israelis coming in. But aren't you all bored with that same scenario? It never seems to end. There's never a possibility. It's like I pull my hair out. That's never going to change. They're never going to all of a sudden think differently. So.
I'm sorry for interruption.
No, I'm glad you asked that. That was a really good one.
If anyone has any questions,
so as you just said that seeing the same photo of Israel and Palestine fighting over and over again makes us feel bored. Like you've followed Sanduk Reed for 30 years, 3 decades. Didn't you ever get bored of like taking the same sorts, is transplanting the eyes, extracting the cataract? Didn't you ever felt bored of doing the same thing again and again?
Well, I say that because I'm not just a guy that's all about photos. You know, like I'm also thinking, well, it's something that I can contribute. At least, I mean, if it was just about my career, it was just about like me and how could I be this or that. I do feel like it's the one thing that I can do where I'm contributing in some way to that issue because I know it so well. Also, I just like to go, I mean, just on a personal experience level, I just like to go and support Dr. Rui. And I never say no to those sorts of things. I feel my whole body of work I've done on blindness prevention, every now and then I get a new photo that's a bit adding to that body of work of all those different places. I mean, with Dr. Reed, that's one thing, but with the Fred Hollows Foundation, we travel to Kenya or to, I'm just trying to give you Myanmar, hasn't been a while, Bangladesh. Each place, everything's just a little bit different, but you're right, it's a similar sort of story. I think at that point, well, it's not about me, it's more about what I'm able to contribute. I feel it's meaningful, that I feel meaningful. When those photos that I've done 100 times, but I've done them again, and the fundraising appeals just made $8 million, I feel like I've done something. I feel like I've done something positive because I know it so well, and I'm adding my strong images so that the donor is wanting to contribute and help as well. Now, this is not journalism necessarily fully. It's part of what I've learned from journalism. I'm adding it to my, I guess you might call it marketing as well, you know. But it's the truth. It's a real thing happening. I'm just making my images more compelling, trying to make them more compelling. I mean, I'm getting down on my knees with the child. I'm not just photographing from here. I get involved. Yeah, I feel there, because I've been in journalism now for like close to 40 years, it's just nice to know that what you've done isn't just another photo that gets forgotten about. That's how I feel. You know? So if I was doing football or something like that, I mean, I could be covering another game. I've seen these sports photographers working for Getty. They've been doing it for 40 years. And then it's another game, and they kick a goal, and someone wins. At the end, they put their arms in the air. It's all very similar as well. Each play is different. You are photographing sports history, say, and same in here in Nepal, you'd be photographing sports history. But this humanitarian sort of scenario is, you know, I also sort of think, well, there's certain times, if I want to be creative, then I'll go and do some other project. But with this blindness stuff, it's more about the bigger story. It's more about the bigger project, and I'm just one of the people in that whole thing.
any more questions from the floor? Anyone? Maybe we can ask something related to the world press, because most of us are from the journalism and the press photographers, so probably someone wants to ask, or someone, maybe they want to know the selection.
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about that. I can talk a bit about, well, what I think in the world press. I mean, I was nominating it once.
I would like to ask you one question. The time has been changing now. Mostly the media house and all
they prefer to have a multimedia person rather than photography or photojournalist or something like that. It has been changing, and as per the time for journalists, we should also start working as a multimedia person in a media house. So
absolutely.
How have you seen in your country, and it has been quite long that we have been doing up and down in Nepal, between Nepal family. So what kind of changes have you seen in media field as well? I think you have already seen quite a number of times in papers and online portals over here.
That is such a pertinent question. It's such a pertinent question because the way I see it back in Australia, now I don't know what stage you guys are at, right? But back in Australia, the most valuable visual communicator is one, for example, we have a television station called, it's the government television, it's the ABC, right? The ones that are the most valuable are the ones that can do multi-platforms. In other words, they can take still photographs, they can do video, they could do a stand-up to camera, they could write a story. That is the communicator of the times. They're valuable because they've got these multiple uses. And I think under any circumstance they're valuable. I'm like an old codger. If we want to talk about the old and the new, when I grew up as the press photographer, all they do was take photographs. All they do was photographs. That's as simple as that, right? Now, at most newspapers, they've dropped the video bit, that you have to do both. They've worked out that to do both is just not successful. Both the video is compromised and the still photography is compromised. But I do think that the most valuable visual communicator is going to be the one that can do all the platforms. I do video, absolutely. I don't want to seem like I want to seem like a contemporary communicator. So I will say that I'm still photography and video. I do say to the client, well, and I only time I ever get hired is to do still photographs, and can you do a little bit of video? So the video would be like, can you just do an interview with someone? So I'll wire them up with lapel mics, and we'll do the interview. For Fred Holloway's Foundation, I've often done both video and still photography when two of us can't go somewhere. And usually it's contributing to a newspaper. So say, for example, I went to Ethiopia, and the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper, they brought a journalist along. And so my job, working for the Fred Holloway's Foundation, and this is what might happen here at some stage, is that we give the material to the newspaper because they can't afford to bring their own person anymore. In actual fact, the Fred Holloway's Foundation pays for the journalist to come on the job. This is journalism. This would never have happened years ago, as you say, the old days. These things are being relaxed now. Admittedly, it's a good cause. It's not like we're trying to tell everybody that I'm trying to think of a contentious issue of sorts about climate change or something. It's a feel-good story. It's always just going to be a feel-good story. But with that, I will do still photographs, and then I'll set up to do interview with the journalist, subjects they want to do. So I've got to be a little bit versatile. Actually, that's why I've gone for this camera, actually, because it's great to swap over to video really quickly and easily. It's actually got the follow focus on the video. So everything is so simple to do still photographs at a pretty high resolution. I think it might be 24 megapixels or something. And then I can click over to video, and I can really simply, by pulling this little thing out, just roll the video, and it's got image stabilization in the lens, image stabilization in this. I can do a little bit of video, and I've covered both. It's not ideal, it's not the best way of doing things, but I really do think you've got to try and embrace it in some way. You may not need to. I need to, so I just do it. And also, there are some stories that are really well done, well told in video. Some things are stills stories. I think that's another point I could make, actually, is that even with the World Press Photo scenario, there's like some stories are just meant for still photography. Other stories are really the writer's story. The photographer is just sort of illustrating the writer's narrative. So as a World Press photo, looking for the stories that you're going to enter into that, I think it really does have to be something that's internationally unique, and Nepal would just have so much great stories here that would be fantastic for World Press photo type entry. And you know, I try to choose stories that are meant for still photography, and not, some stories are good for video because you can get the commentary from the subject and things like that, and other stories are just great still photography stories. So I think one has to be mindful of those sorts of things.
Any more questions?
Lots of questions regarding pictures and photographs and all news materials and other printing or out of media pictures as well. But the most important thing is, how do you manage your time for your family and your work? So it's a very difficult task for the photojournalist, either it's for female or female, it doesn't matter. But we have very lost time every time. So how do you manage your time for your family and your work?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because look, I must admit, and to be quite revealing on a personal level, I didn't know whether I was going to have children at all. As it turns out, I've got a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. But when I was younger and very consumed in journalism, I just thought, well, I'm not going to have time. You know, like I've got to dedicate time to be a family man. It's sort of hard when you're in journalism and you're working on the weekends, you're working different hours and shifts and all that sort of stuff. So I didn't actually think so much. And eventually, I decided that I just didn't want to just have photos. That would be my thing. I would just have photos. I thought, no, I might have to sacrifice a little bit. And now I've gotten a little bit older. Maybe I got to experience a lot of those photojournalistic experiences that satisfied me to a certain extent. So that's when I decided, oh well, we made a conscious decision to have children, have a family. But it really does, it is difficult I'm here. I don't travel that much really, relative to other people. But you've got to have a very understanding partner, I guess. Eventually I decided to balance the two, not to be so journalistically obsessive. Of course my work would have suffered for that, but on a personal level I wanted to have a more balanced life. But it is a tough one when you've got family and you've got to work different hours, and sometimes you've just got to keep working because the story's happening. You can't just go home. But that's the reward of our job too, is that we're experiencing things that others in society don't get to experience, aspects of society. I would say that's the biggest reward for this job, is that you get to meet people, go to places, access, see things that the general mass population, even the best of doctors and the best of lawyers and professionals and whatever, they don't get that richness of life experience that often we photojournalists get the opportunity and journalists get to do. So I don't know if I've answered that question well or not, but it's a hard one, isn't it? I can't really tell you what the answer is, other than it just becomes a bit of a balance, and it's hard, depending on what the demands are of your publication.
So, festival, yes.
That's right. Well, I was with 3 others, and we started a thing called reportage. And in those days, documentary photography in Australia was sort of not given very good status. The art world had, where galleries and things would exhibit works, they didn't take that very seriously. And even journalistically, the newspaper they would support, but people who did things independently would do this amazing work that had a lot of difficulty getting published. Today, I guess, we've got Instagram, all those things that you can show it on Instagram. Hey, but showing it on Instagram is like showing it like a little thumbnail. It's so small, really, when you think of it. But we didn't have Instagram and things like that to share these works. So what we do is we get our friends together, like this sort of scenario, but it was like a lot of people. We booked out like a 600-person sort of hall. We set up a big projector and we showed the work that was not being seen in the newspaper, the work that photographers would do of their own fruition, their own funding and their own ideas and things like that. And we did that for quite some years. And then, for some reason, it was less needed. There were more outlets for that sort of photography. And so it sort of dwindled out of it. And also us photographers were too busy. Like, we were doing the photography. We weren't organisers of photography. We didn't want to be that. We wanted to be, I wanted to be out photographing, not organising an event, all the time. A big event. These were huge.
Yeah, I wonder because why it was not quite after 2014.
Yeah, it started to slow down. Yeah, it started to slow down. There are other people doing these presentation things now. Like there's a thing called Head On, and so you can show things that are Head On photo festival. There's photo festivals all over the place now. But at the time in Australia, we sort of started this energy for a couple of years there of the reportage festival. And I think that this could be the good thing to do in Nepal. I don't know, you may already do it perhaps.
We are doing this some kind of a thing, but not like a continuing, like frequently, occasionally. So probably we will have that kind of idea and we can continue in the future. So I just wonder because you know that in Australia it could be like not continuing after 2014. It was like stop.
Yeah, we just stopped it. Yeah, I think also it's one of those things. It takes a lot of organising and energy, and it's a big job to do that sort of thing. And so maybe selfishly, perhaps we did it at the time we're younger, we're hungrier. It's best done by young, hungry. Maybe you don't have, wife and 2 kids. So like, I've got a wife and 2 kids now, so it's another bunch of commitments. I've got to be available for my daughter's dance concert and the other ones, this and that, whatever. When we were younger, we didn't have children. We had more time on our hands. We were hanging out. So what I started doing before this reportage was I would have these soirees or sorts, either in a photo studio or in someone's lounge room, and we did exactly the same thing. We'd show our latest project, we talked about it. It was a little bit like a community, so supporting one another, encouraging, sharing information, things like that. Yeah, I did that for a while and organised that. And then I did this reportage with the other 3 guys. And then after a while, I just got to that point where it wasn't that young, hungry scenario. It's the young, hungry.
Is that because the technology has changed the scenario? Even what?
Yeah, that could be another thing. Technology may also have changed the scenario. Although still people want to... We don't hear from the photographer, we don't hear from the creative people. We just see the photos. I mean, I must admit, it is incredible, isn't it? I can be following Sebastião Salgado, the great Brazilian photographer. Or I could be watching, I could be reading the content of some of the great photographers in the world now. I could be looking at the Ukraine conflict on Instagram by the photographers that are there and getting insights about what their experience is. It's another level of just the general news. Another problem to the newspaper is that sometimes we're getting more detail or whatever from other avenues than we are from the traditional newspaper. So, yeah, well, these days I'm looking at content from all sorts of levels, from Twitter to Instagram to the traditional newspapers. But then one's on the fringe, and then directly from certain blogs and things like that. Yeah, it's a whole different media environment, isn't it, really? One has to sort of think a little bit ahead. I'm not sure if it's going to hit Nepal too soon or not.
Can we, it's been already 2 hours, so
oh.
probably you are...
You said 1 hour, I've got 2 hours. I'm so sorry. You guys all want to go home.